Hello, I am Castillo, and today I am doing a presentation on residential segregation. I'm using the head, heart, and hand framework, and this is a little bit about what each part means. The head focuses on data and systemic practices. Heart highlights personal stories and broader societal effects, and the hand emphasizes actionable solutions, policies for change. This framework ensures a comprehensive analysis connecting intellectual understanding, emotional resonance, and practical advocacy. Some historical context. Residential segregation did not arise by chance. It was constructed through deliberate policies and practices. Land ownership post-slavery. Following emancipation, African Americans were systematically denied opportunity to own land. Promises such as 40 acres were resigned, leaving freed individuals without a foundation for economic stability. That comes from the class text. Federal Housing and Mission, FHA, established in 1934, supported redlining and other practices that excluded black families from home ownership. For example, the 1938 FHA underwriting manual explicitly recommended racial restrictions to maintain property values, and that comes from the class text as well. These policies created generational wealth gaps that persist today, disproportionately disadvantaging black families. Here's the phrase 40 acres and a mule. In 1865, during the Civil War, General William Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside 40-acre plots of abandoned Confederate land for formerly enslaved families in an area that traversed the coastal regions of South Carolina and Florida. This gave newly freed black families a foundation for economic independence. The mule part of this phrase came from the fact that the freed families were temporarily settled on this land, but these people thought that the land would be their permanent residency. Broken promise. The original plan of redistribution of land was reversed following President Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. Andrew Johnson became president, and he restored land ownership to the original white landowners, evicting black families from their land they have been promised through Sherman's order. Despite this promise, the government never implemented a national policy, leaving African Americans vulnerable, and allowed families to fall into an exploitative system such as sharecropping. This action reinforced racial inequality as it ensured that white landowners retained their wealth while black Americans were relegated to poverty. Residential segregation. This refers to the separation of different groups of people into distinct neighborhoods based on race, ethnicities, or income. That's definition based on the class text. This separation was reinforced through mechanisms such as redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and steering by real estate agents. Redlining refers to where minority neighborhoods were marked as high risk on maps and limited access to mortgages and investments. Restrictive covenants refers to contracts explicitly barred non-white families from purchasing homes in certain areas, and steering refers to when realtors directed families to neighborhoods based on race. These practices all entrenched inequality by limiting access to quality housing, education, and economic opportunity. Redlining and its legacy. The FHA, established in 1934, was created to stabilize the economy and promote ownership. FHA-backed loans, however, reinforced segregation by favoring white neighborhoods and excluding minorities. The Homeowner Loan Corporation and redlining. The Homeowner Loan Corporation created residentially security maps in the 1930s, marking predominantly black and immigrant neighborhoods in red as high risk. This practice denied access to home loans for minority communities, systemically blocking home ownership based on race and ethnicity. The impact of redlining: economic disparities. Denied wealth building opportunities for black families, contributing to racial wealth gap. Segregation. Institutionalized housing segregation, concentrating poverty in redline areas. Long-term effects: redline areas face disinvestment, lower property values, and worse health and educational outcomes. Legacy. Redlining was banned in 1968, but its effects persist today in racial segregation and inequality. Discriminatory lending practices continue, exacerbating economic disparities. Racially restrictive covenants. By definition, they are contractual agreements included in property deeds that prohibit the sale or lease of property to non-white individuals, effectively enforcing racial segregation in housing. Similar practice: steering is a practice where real estate agents directed white clients to homes in white neighborhoods and black clients to homes in predominantly black neighborhoods, reinforcing segregation. The impact: exclusion. These covenants prevented black families from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods, limiting their access to wealth building opportunities through home ownership. Perpetuated segregation. Restrictive covenants and steering kept minority communities isolated, reducing their access to resources and opportunities in better neighborhoods. The long-term consequences: the effects of these practices are still felt today in housing patterns, with lasting racial segregation and economic disparities in property ownership. It's all cited from class text, chapter 10. Environmental racism. By definition, it is institutional policies and practices that have disproportionately affected the health outcomes and living conditions of communities based on race or color. Often manifests in the placement of hazardous industries, pollution, and inadequate infrastructure in minority and low-income neighborhoods. Pollution in minority communities. Communities of color, especially Black, Indigenous, and Latino populations, are more likely to live near toxic waste sites, industrial facilities, high traffic areas, exposing them to harmful pollutants such as lead, air toxins, and contaminated water. For example, the Flint water crisis is a predominant example of environmental racism, where the predominantly Black population of Flint, Michigan, was exposed to lead-contaminated drinking water due to cost-cutting measures of government neglect. Another example: air quality. Many minority communities, especially in urban areas, suffer from poor air quality due to their proximity to factories, highways, and power plants, leading to higher rates of respiratory disease like asthma. Impact: health disparities. Exposure to the environmental hazards leads to increased rates of respiratory disease, cancer, birth defects, and other chronic health conditions in affected communities. Economic inequality. Environmental racism often occurs in low-income areas where communities have less political power and fewer resources to fight for environmental justice or inadequate health care. Intergenerational effects. The long-term effects of environmental racism include diminished quality of life, increased healthcare costs, and reduced life expectancy for affected populations. And all of my sources are in the bottom here. Survivors. Residential segregation has left deep scars on the individual and families who lived through this harshest periods. Generational impact. Survivors often describe strained familial relationships and limited opportunities for upward mobility due to systemic exclusion. These stories humanize the data, showing resilience in the face of systemic barriers. Historic testimonies. Survivors of segregational era policies recount systemic exclusion from housing, education, enduring substandard living conditions. For example, Eugene Burnett's denial of a home in Leventon illustrates the emotional and financial toll. Generational impact. Many survivors describe strained family relationships as economic hardship, limited opportunities for upward mobility. It highlights how stories provide a human face to the data, grounding the broader narrative in personal experience. These are two survivors I want to highlight in my presentation. Eugene Burnett is a Black Army veteran who attempted to purchase a home in Leventon in 1949, but was denied due to racial policies. His story highlights the systemic exclusion of Black families from wealth-building opportunities. And Sabria Ihsan Williams, a Black Muslim woman who lived in an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood and expressed frustration at being stereotyped despite her family's success. Her story underscores the persistence of racial stereotyping and the emotional toll of systemic inequality. Here are emotional and psychological impact. The human cost of residential segregation extends beyond economic disadvantage, impacting mental health, community cohesion, and intergenerational wealth. Community isolation. Segregated neighborhoods often lack access to quality schools, healthcare, and employment opportunities, creating cycles of poverty. Generational wealth gap. White families benefit from inherited wealth, often rooted in discriminatory policies that excluded Black families. For example, Eugene Burnett was denied a home in Leventon. It illustrates the systemic barriers. Mental health impacts. Living in under-resourced neighborhoods contributes to chronic stress, anxiety, and reduced life expectancy. These effects highlight the urgent need for systemic reform to address these disparities. Today, residential segregation remains deeply entrenched in the United States. Persistent segregation. Cities like Milwaukee have black-white segregation indexes above 80, highlighting stark divides. Despite legal changes, Black families are still 2.7 times more likely to be denied a mortgage than white families, even with similar credit scores. Economic consequences. Limited access to home ownership prevents wealth accumulation. Black and Latino families possess less than 9% of wealth held by white families. These patterns perpetuate inequality, locking marginalized communities out of opportunities for upward mobility. Source: Pew Research Center. This is a call to empathy. Empathy is key to understanding the lived experiences of those affected by residential segregation. Here's a question to consider. How would your life be different if your family had been denied the opportunity to own a home or pass down wealth? And here's a personal story. Reflecting on the lived experiences of resilient individuals like Sabriya Ihsan Williams provides us with insight and highlights the frustration of being stereotyped despite personal success. Current implications. The legacy of residential segregation affects contemporary social and economic structures. Mental health. Many families experience long-term psychological impacts, including stress and trauma due to systemic exclusion. Educational gaps. Schools in segregated neighborhoods often lack funding, perpetuating cycles of poverty. Community strain. Isolation from integrated spaces limits social mobility and creates barriers to employment and resources. These implications demonstrate that residential segregation is not just historical, but continues to shape inequities today. Reparations, reconciliation, and restoration. Acknowledging past injustices is the first step towards equity. Reparations, financial restitution for communities impacted by redlining and discriminatory housing policies. Example, compensation programs for families who face mortgage discriminations would be a reparation. Reconciliation, truth and reconciliation commissions to document harm caused by segregation. Community healing programs focused on rebuilding trust would be great. Restoration, urban revitalization projects such as parks and transportation hubs to improve community resources. Asset-based social policies to help minority families build generational wealth. These would all be great first steps towards equity. Justice. Justice requires dismantling systemic barriers and building equitable structures. Healthcare infrastructure. Ensure equitable access to healthcare in segregated neighborhoods. Cultural identity. Protect and promote diverse cultural spaces in historically segregated areas. Policy enforcement. Strengthen anti-discriminatory laws and enforce fair housing policies. Justice is about creating systems that no longer perpetuate harm and ensuring opportunities for all. Call to action. Change begins with informed and engaged individuals. So what can you do? You can learn more. You can read. For example, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein is a great book. Documentaries, Race, The Power of an Illusion. Advocate for change. Support housing equity policies. Join organizations like the NAACP. Participate in local initiatives such as Habit for Humanity. Addressing residential segregation requires collective action to dismantle systemic barriers and promote justice for future generations. Conclusion. Residential segregation is not merely a historic issue. It's a living legacy that shapes inequality today. Some key takeaways. Systemic policies created these divisions, and systemic efforts are required to dismantle them. The impacts of segregation ripple through generations. reinforcing cycles of poverty and exclusion. Collective action and informed advocacy are essential to achieving equity. And this is a quote from Benjamin Franklin that I would like to leave off with. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Thank you.